Okay, so today I am the host, master ceremonies, if you will. And at the end of our last episode, I asked if my fellow authors would like to tell us who their favorite authors are, anywhere from one to five or six, depending on how much time, I'll try to keep people corralled into a time, but who they are, but more importantly, why they are their favorite authors. So I will like to start today with Lucinda, and then I'll just work my way around visually around the way I have the screen. So Lucinda, so favorite authors.
I think I'll have to start right back in my childhood. This my favorite author was Enid Blyton, and I remember as a precocious little brat reading her before I even went to school, and everything, the Faraway Tree, Noddy, Castle of Adventure, Famous Five, and all that. I remember thinking to myself, as I say, pretentious brat, bar none, is that wow, this looks easy. I could do that, which was a bit of a stretch. But I think she was probably my favorite author very much at the time. Then moving on, when I was ill for a while, I was in bed and somebody gave me a series of books by somebody called William Harrison Ainsworth. And they were written as historical novels, but he wrote them in the 18th century. So they were quite dense in many ways. They were very detailed, but he wrote about the plague and about Henry VIII and that kind of thing. So I was fascinated by that. And it started my love for history, that's for sure. Then to be really sort of backward, because I don't think she's in vogue anymore, I loved Jean Plady's books because she, again, historical novels, took me back into the past, but she did it with very much easy to read, easy to get into the characters. You could just imagine yourself there. You could imagine yourself being a queen or a knight or a serving wench or whatever.
That immersion context, right?
Yes, very much. She took you into the character. You were there. You could see everything that was going on. You felt it. You lived in the moment. And then I suppose for other favorite authors, I would probably go for Stephen Leather. I've got back into recently. Not all of his books, but I think I like books that move quickly. I like books that keep me guessing, which is why I never read a book, very rarely a second time round, because I know what the ending is going to be. Same for films. And generally, if they can keep me guessing until the last chapter, then for me, that's a good book. So I think he covers a lot of things. I can't remember the name of his hero now, but it's not a Jack Reacher, but it's similar to that. And the other one is the name of somebody whose name I can't remember offhand. Isn't that awful? But he writes about Germany in the 16th century, which again I find fascinating. So basically, I think those are, rundown of my favorite ones.
So definitely a theme of historical novels and with
adventure and travel. Yes, very much so.
Travel
and once at the end of every year on my blog, I'm really a bit retentive, I suppose, because I keep a spreadsheet of every book I read. Well, I've been doing it for the last 10 years. And I put down when I've downloaded it, because I tend not to read paperbacks, when I've read it, when I've written a review, and when I've posted a review. And I then mark up in blue all the books that have really grabbed me in that year. At the end of the year, I do 4 blogs with 3 books each of my best books per year. And looking at it this year, they've been very much historical. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I could see that theme is there for your favorite authors. I just want to make a comment. That sense of immersion. It's funny because you said once you know how a book ends, you won't read it again, and that's generally true for me. Definite exception of those that really bring you to that period. I sometimes like to revisit them because maybe I missed some nuance or details about that period. And one of the authors that didn't make it on my list, because I was trying to keep the authors who had a pretty wide portfolio, was Robert Graves, I, Claudius, and that really, really brings you back. And that actually, to me, is one of my favorite masterpiece books. But yeah, so I kind of, get that feeling of what you say about, with the historical novels, you're getting in there, you have that sense. But for me, I do like to revisit those particular ones. So for that reason.
Can I have a question? What was the fourth author you mentioned, Lucinda?
I'm just trying to remember.
After Jean Plady and before the one whose name you forgot.
Stephen Leather.
Stephen what?
Stephen Leather.
Okay.
He's a British writer, and he's had some quite famous TV series on, adapted for TV. But he writes about Singapore. He writes, stories set in Singapore, Middle East, London, all over. He's obviously done a lot of traveling, and in Thailand as well. And he did a couple of very emotive books about call girls in Thailand. To what extent he did research, I would hate to say, but he certainly had it down to the, right down to the nitty gritty, if you like.
Hopefully he was using his imagination for
that. Probably.
Or at worst, secondhand information from other people, right? Okay. Anything else you'd like to add, or that the phone?
I'm fairly an eclectic reader, but I do a lot of reviewing for readers' favorites. So I read a lot of, not always unknown authors. They're not all self-published either. But I'm finding more and more these days that the better books are self-published. Stephen King, Stephen Leather, they've both now gone self-published. And I think, Stephen King I had a thing about, and I had a thing for Dennis Wheatley for a while. I read everything he wrote. But I don't read love stories. I don't read romances. I don't read cozy mysteries. I like something with a bit of meat in it, from the point of view that, I must admit, my husband and I do tend to watch the same kind of films, not necessarily war films where it goes bang, bang, bang. It's ridiculous, but generally things that are not sloppy and soppy and, that kind of thing. I like it with a little bit of mystery, clever things, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. That's definitely a reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to comment on that before we move to the next person? Okay, next up is Mark.
So I struggle with this a little bit because I tend to be a fan of books, not necessarily of authors. And I've definitely gone through, I went through my Stephen King phase and my John Grisham phase and my Tom Clancy phase and all those authors who write countless books. And at some point I read enough and I just kind of start to get bored with them and lose interest. So the ones that I came up with, the first is Wally Lamb, who wrote She's Come Undone. And then the book that I read first that just kind of blew my socks off was I Know This Much Is True, which is about two twins, one of them who's basically, I don't know, I forget, schizoid or something like that. And it's just this, I don't know, to me, it's just so epic. And that's kind of what he does, is he writes very epic stories. He only publishes a book every 5 or 6 years. And you can tell that he puts everything into whatever he publishes. I've read She's Come Undone and I Know This Much Is True. And there's a couple of more that came out after that one that I've read. And I like those kinds of intense, long stories. So Wally Lamb. And the other one I came up with a couple nights ago because I started watching Under the Banner of Heaven on Hulu. And Under the Banner of Heaven is a 7-episode series based on a book by John Krakauer about a murder in a fundamentalist Mormon community family. And John Krakauer, to me, I love reading real life stories that read like novels, that read like fiction. And John Krakauer has done that multiple times. Into the Wild, which is about a very deadly season on Mount Everest. I'm sorry, Into Thin Air is the Mount Everest story. Into the Wild, which was made into a movie about a guy who decided to walk into the Alaska wilderness and eventually died there. Under the Banner of Heaven, Where Men Find Glory, just incredible true stories that he tells very well. And then the third one, because we're all indie authors here, I had to name an indie author. Present company excluded because we can't talk about each other's books. But anyway,
feel free.
Kevin Brennan to me is a great example of a high quality indie writer who puts good stories out there.
What was the name again? Just because
Kevin Brennan.
Brennan. Okay.
Yeah. I think I've read every book he's written, and his very first book was traditionally published, and it's kind of like a Wally Stegner, John Steinbeck epic tale of the West. And it kind of amazed me that he did that, and then he left traditional publishing, and he's been independently publishing since. Although recently he blogged that he may be done writing, at least novels anyway. But anyway, those are the three that I came up with. Like I said, I generally very rarely find a favorite author that goes, throughout their whatever. Like Ron Curry wrote a book called Everything Matters. That's one of my absolute favorite books, but I've read other things that he's written and it just doesn't hit me the same as Everything Matters. So me, it's more about the books than the authors.
Oh, that's a fair assessment, because I mean, the same could be true, you could say, of music, although people do say they have their favorite bands, musicians, etc.
Yeah.
We all know that not every album, every song is a favorite, but
right.
So that is fair. You could always read.
And I've had this theory for years. I've written about it on my blog and stuff, that creative people only have so much true creativity in them. There's a point at which there's nothing left in the bank, and music is the best example to me, because all of my favorite musicians have a few good albums and then it just kind of loses it. And I think a lot of writers are that way too, that you can't possibly keep coming up with something new. At some point you start to get derivative of yourself.
I think that definitely is truer where the musicians, the writers, etc., are doing this as part of their normal income, etc. So there's always the next deadline, or the next album, the next release, or without which you don't have a salary sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've noticed that. That there are a few. When I'm thinking of music, there are a few artists out there that seem to have managed, to put out a whole flurry of albums and then maybe died out afterwards. But I do notice some, and it's more or less true of authors. You can almost tell that they're just, this book they weren't into. It wasn't like they just tossed it out, but there definitely seems to be more of a rote pattern in it. Like, all right, here's my story, here's my characters, etc. And then sometimes the next one that comes after that will be like, wow, okay, good. So you could tell there are those got to meet the paycheck kind of.
I think that's the problem, is a lot of musicians feel they have to put an album out every year, or authors who have to put a book out every year. I mean, Stephen King's the best example of that. And that's one of the reasons why I like Wally Lamb, is books come out from him every 5 or 6 years, and he's not racing to put something out there. And I think you can tell by the quality of his stories.
Do you think this is partly because people like James Patterson and Wilbur Smith in that are actually co-writing books with other people because they've just sort of reached the end of their creative tether.
I don't know what the story is with James Patterson.
Yeah.
I don't know Wilbur Smith, but it just seems what James Patterson is doing is just so bizarre to me. And I think I read one James Patterson book somewhere in the last 10 or 12 years, and there were some just stupid things in the book that convinced me I would never read another James Patterson book. The one thing I remember is at the end of the story, the heroine is swimming through seaweed in a mountain lake. And there were several things like that. And it's like, okay, I don't know what the story is with him. And the idea that other people write his books and he slaps his name on it means I'm never going to read another book of his.
Yeah, I rarely like to knock an author, and so I'm not here. I'm just saying that from my point of view, Patterson is more of a business than a writer. I think it's more about the business than the writing, and that's why you have the quality issues that you may see, or the fact that other people have been do the bulk of the work and then he puts his name on it. I mean, he could have been a publishing house instead of, but it's all branding and business.
Yep.
So, and hey, makes a fortune for him. So, okay, let me put a stop to that. And next on my circle is Audrey.
Okay.
Oh, wait, Mark, were you done?
Yes, I was done. That's the best I could come up with.
Oh, I thought we hit that point. So, okay. Audrey.
Well, I will mention, I think, 3 authors and a passing reference to a 4th one. I looked in my Goodreads books I've read, and I don't have, a lot of people on Goodreads have, what do they call them, shelves. And so they have labels for, good books, bad books, mysteries, I don't have very many shelves, but I do have one called multiple reread books.
Oh.
And so I looked at that because I thought that would reinforce kind of my hazy idea of who my favorites were. Now, I think the 3 people I'm going to mention are no longer alive. The first one is Mary Renault. She was a British woman who moved to South Africa and wrote historical novels, mostly set in ancient Greece. And there was the life of Theseus, who may have not even been a real person. And then a couple of guys in Athens around the time, just after Pericles, or just around that time, and then the civil war with Sparta, and so on. And so she's picked out, okay, Theseus was sort of a legendary hero, and the others were more realistic. One's an actor, there was a poet, and then Alexander the Great. She sort of did a fictional biography of him. Now, most of these books were related in first person by the character themselves. Not the first of the Alexander books, I don't think. But I think that's why I really like first person, and that's why it is my sort of go-to voice for writing things, because you were right in that character and seeing things through their eyes. And again, it was so vivid. I mean, it was like a perfect mind movie, with colors and just the feelings of whatever was happening. You could feel it and see it. And so I've really, quite apart from the historical interest, and I do admit that a lot of what I do know about these times and people was shaped largely by reading these books rather than by reading, factual books, although some of the facts I've kind of gone and checked and so on, just for interest. So that's my first one, Mary Renault. Now, the next person is not a fiction author, was a fellow named Henry Mitchell, who wrote for the Washington Post. And one of the things he had was a column on gardening. He was a keen gardener, as I am. And so he had a weekly thing where he'd write about some garden topic, and in a very engaging way, and sort of folksy, but not really I mean, he didn't sound uneducated, even though he sounded folksy, if you know what I mean. You could tell that the guy was more sophisticated than just your basic dirt farmer type. And I honestly don't know what other things he wrote about in the Washington Post. But at some point, his wife decided that a book had to be published of all these columns, like compiled and so on. And she was the one who pitched it to publishers. And I think she bought the rights for these things from him for $1 or something, just so she could go out and do that. And so a couple of books were published, The Essential Earthman and Henry Mitchell on Gardening, on One Man's Garden. And it's all about his own personal views and experiences with growing different plants and designing gardens and all this stuff. But it was just the voice, I think. And I found I've kind of, well, maybe not so much now, but at one point I had kind of absorbed his style. And so when I'd write about my garden, I'd kind of do it in a Mitchell-esque way, even though my garden's totally different from his. Like Washington, D.C. is way different from Victoria, and our soils were different. And also he was a guy from the South. He was a Southerner. And so he kind of brought that perspective. And that to me was kind of interestingly foreign, because obviously I don't have anything to do with the US South at all. I don't even know anybody from there besides. So there was those two aspects. The engaging voice and just interesting stuff, and personal experience of, doing gardening, which was kind of important for me. Okay, the third one I'll mention is Barbara Vine, another British author. And I believe Barbara Vine is a pseudonym. She also wrote a whole lot of books under Ruth Rendell, which I never read. I tried one and I didn't like it.
Yeah.
But her Barbara Vine books are so interesting. Like they're murder mysteries, but there's a lot more to it than some detective, either amateur or professional, tracking down a murderer. There's sort of, the murder is kind of embedded in other things, like life during World War II for civilians in Britain, and family things. There's a lot of stuff about family secrets, but they're not they're somewhat sordid family secrets, but they're not, the sordidity isn't the point. It's kind of the how they happen to be secrets, and different perspectives of the person telling the story about the family members and what they knew and what they wondered about, and just tracking down some of this stuff. So I think my favorite is called The Dark Adapted Eye. That's the one set in World War II. And it kind of boils down to who was the mother of this kid that turned up. And usually, it's who's the father, right? Because it's usually fairly obvious who the mother was. But this was who the mother was, and there was just a lot more to it than that. But it's just so interesting. And then there's another one called Asta's Book, which is about some immigrants to Britain from Denmark, and then their descendants, and one of the descendants trying to figure out the truth of something that was related in diaries. And that's another thing I like, is books that reference other books. I don't know, I don't like books about movies or movie making, and I don't like books about authors being authors. But if there's a sort of mystery book in a book, then I'm all over it. So those are my three, because Barbara Vine for just the intricacy and mystery of those stories. And I will mention Stephen King in passing, because I did read a lot of his books, especially his early ones. Anytime he came out with a new one, I'd buy it. Usually think it was really good. And you have to admit, the guy really knows how to present a character and get you interested in them. And the character is sympathetic, and you kind of want to know more about them. I think he's really got that. Now, some of his latest books, the plots end very disappointingly. Like, he's kind of got you going along with him, and it sounds interesting, and then boom, you get this stupid ending that involves something big and monstrous that you just don't want to forget it. I think maybe, I hate to say it, but I think when he stopped using drugs, his writing deteriorated, or at least his plotting abilities deteriorated.
He was in that accident. He was hit by a car while walking in
Yeah.
Maine, and I think, like, just before that happened, he announced that he was going to retire, and he wasn't going to write anymore. And then he had that accident, and he's writing. And I think most of everything he's written since then is, as you just described it. It's just not that good.
Yeah. Well, and of course he's getting on. And you know what we said about
Yeah.
running out of juice in
Yeah.
your writing life?
Yeah.
Well, it could be he's hit that point. And you can't really
Yeah.
blame, I mean, you can't, you know, like the guy's old, he's written a ton of stuff, so let's
Yeah.
not be too hard on him. I do know one of his books that I quite like, even though it's sort of awful, is Gerald's Game. It's about the woman that ends up handcuffed to a bed and her husband dies of a heart attack because they were doing this sort of sex thing, and she kicked him and he had a heart attack and there he was dead. And they're in this cabin and the door is
Yeah.
open and it's fall and there's nobody around and she has to figure out how to get loose from the handcuffs. There's also this extra weirdo thing about an eclipse that happened when she was a kid that sort of links on to another one of his books called, it's the one about the woman in Maine on the little island. I can't remember the name. Somebody, Claiborne. What?
Dolores Claiborne.
Dolores Claiborne.
Yeah, Dolores Claiborne. So it's like these two women are linked by this eclipse. And I've got to tell you, that element, I'm not sure it really needed that, because there was enough in Gerald's Game, just the situation. Imagine being handcuffed to a bed with hardly any clothes on and all the rest of it. And then there's the dog, and then there's the weirdo guy, and you know. So anyway, I quite like that one.
Okay. Just quick thing, because you mentioned, you know, you talked also about immersive historical in the beginning, and it made me realize, because I mentioned Robert Graves, but I have to say, I think if your goal is to bring the reader in the past, I believe you're probably right that, you know, first person voice, it's probably one of its, you know, strongest uses, is if you want to bring someone into a past, you know, period of history, that might be the best way to do it.
But you have to have a lot of stuff there. Like you have to have had a lot of research and done a lot of thinking. So you're not superficial.
Yeah, that's why I said Robert Graves, because the details around those first few Roman emperors, you know, there was so much information, and that's what he is. He's a historian primarily. But yeah, so I did want to bring that out because there was a theme between you and Lucinda.
Well, it's probably about the safest kind of book to write these days, because if you set it in the modern age, you don't know who you're upsetting, who you're offending, abusing, criticizing, running down, ignoring. So the recent ones I've been writing are psychological thrillers, but I would think that to be on the safe side, write historical novels, then nobody can complain, because that's how it was in those days.
Right.
But the problem with writing historical novels is making sure that it's true to the time and people are not talking in ways that they talk now versus how people talked 200 years ago. That's one of the things that I struggle with when I read historical novels, or, you know, something that's supposed to be set in a time in the past. It's like, okay, but people didn't, I'm just going to use a horrible exaggeration of this, but people didn't say, oh, that's cool back in the 1800s. You know what I mean? But it just, sometimes when I read those, it's like, no, people didn't say that back then. I'm sorry.
Again, though, if that's your goal, is to bring people to that time, you're absolutely right. But if it's satire, for instance, I've read satires and stand-ups where, you know,
that would make sense. But if they're trying to be true,
if you're going to lose it, and I have to admit, you're right, because I remember there's a number of books that I read where that's what lost me. It's like my brain went at that point, that's not what people did back then, or not what people said back then, or whatever. And now you've lost the person. You really do have to be careful and make sure that it is, even, you know, as Audrey pointed out, it's not just fluff. There's meat there, and it's accurate. So that is a good challenge. Yeah.
So I had a question for Audrey too. The Barbara Vine, who also writes under the name Ruth Rendell. Did you say you just read one of the Ruth Rendell books?
Yeah, I can't even remember which one. And I don't think I even got through it. I think I started it and it was just so not like Vine, and kind of, I don't know, I thought it just wasn't a book that appealed to me for some reason, which is really weird. So she obviously had two totally different
two different writing personalities.
Yeah.
Okay. I just think that's interesting
Mhm.
that someone would do that. And I'm sure she's not the only one.
I know authors who have done that to be in different genres, but different
Yeah.
writing styles. That's cool. Actually.
Well, I think the Rendell books were just straight mysteries. You know, and to be honest, because I haven't read a lot of them, I don't know. Is there a detective that's there all the time, or an investigator? Have you read any of those, Lucinda?
They've televised, they made television series of the Ruth Rendell mysteries.
Mhm.
So I've seen several of them on screen. And I suspect, because as you say, they're fairly straightforward and they are mystery thrillers, that they have taken it pretty much verbatim.
Yeah, whereas the other ones are more the Barbara Vine ones aren't really murder mysteries, although it seems to me somebody does die in there. There's a death and it might be a murder, but that's not really what it's about. It's more about the sort of deceptions and mysteries, like puzzles and family secrets and all. So they're more psychological, I guess. And I guess that appeals to me more than just mysteries.
Okay, let's move to Berthold.
Okay, you all probably knew that the first name on my list will be P.G. Wodehouse.
Really?
I took him off my list because of that.
No.
He has a way of what I love about his books, and I'm mostly focusing on the Jeeves and Wooster series of books. He could just create this world that it felt like a world. It's obviously based on basically 1920s England, but a very fanciful depiction of it, sort of lighthearted, extremely lighthearted. And you just go back there again and again, and he has these characters who are so memorable and so well drawn. Like the first book of his, actually, I was 11 years old, and my dad was like, "Here, I'm going to read you some of this book," and it looked bizarre. It looked kind of like a grown-up book, so I'm like, "What is this thing?" And by the first chapter, I'm listening to it, and I'm hooked because it's got Bertie Wooster, who talks in this burbling, fast mix of slang and he's a well-meaning but kind of dim-witted rich guy. His extremely smart butler, Jeeves, who has his own way of talking that's very refined and logical. And then by, I think, the end of the first chapter, we've got Gussie Fink-Nottle, who is this man who drinks only orange juice and collects newts, and he's shown up dressed in a devil costume. And I know if you haven't read this, you're thinking this sounds bizarre, but you're just hooked and you're off into this world. So that would be my first one. Did you have a comment, Richard?
Well, no, I mentioned that G's is sort of a counterpoint to Bertie in the way he spoke was incredibly terse, or just sometimes raise an eyebrow. That was the extent. But I did want to point out one thing right now. When we talk about Wodehouse, I don't know how apocryphal this is, but years ago, I remember someone else presenting about Wodehouse saying that he used to write every sentence of his book like up on a board so he could make sure it was the funniest it could be, sentence by sentence. Now, I don't know how true that is, but when you read it, you do realize that the word and word order and word choices he uses, yeah, they do lend to it.
Yeah, I can absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And I could go on about Wodehouse, but I won't, since we are.
Yeah, I know. That's why I gotta cut it now. So,
but yes, let me move to a very different sort of author, George Orwell. I think most people probably read at least 1984, maybe Animal Farm. Both great books. He also wrote a lot of essays, as well as some other less. He wrote a lot of good fiction. It's not as gripping or dystopian as like 1984, but he was just a very good writer, and he was a great observer of the world at his time. And this is sort of one thing that's interesting about George Orwell, is that even though he was a very politically involved person, he could write about political issues in just a completely clear way. You never get the sense that he has any agenda to his writing. He's just trying to paint sort of human nature as he sees it playing out, which I think is why, you know, his books are so well remembered and why people still reference 1984 in particular. He just has this way of capturing things and thinking about things that I think is really insightful. My third pick is, this is another author who was a nonfiction author, but he's just a fantastic writer. George Plimpton, a journalist, mainly, but his contribution was participatory journalism, was kind of the thing he popularized. Like, my favorite book by him is called Paper Lion, where he went to go play quarterback for the Detroit Lions, the National Football League. He's terrible at it. He does a miserable job, but you know, I always say he was horrible as a quarterback, but he could write a great book about it. And he could just, the thing I come back to with Plimpton was that he could end a chapter in a way that it was just the perfect way to end that chapter. It's sort of hard to describe without giving the full context, but like every chapter in Paper Lion is like that, and it ends with just a perfectly chosen line. And it's despite the fact that he's nonfiction, he has a very literary way of writing. And he wrote about all sorts of different experiences. I think he conducted an orchestra, and I know he was really into fireworks. I think he oversaw a fireworks show, something like that. I love his writing style. So I'm going with those three well-known authors, and then I'm going to mention an indie author just because, as Mark said, we're indies, and I try to promote them here. Zachary Schatzer is a guy I've been reading a lot of lately. He writes books that frankly remind me a bit of Woodhouse in that they're light and funny, and they have very memorable characters. I've got reviews of some of his books on my blog, and I've been really enjoying him. And he's one who, whenever he has a new book coming out, it's an instant buy.
There you go. Good. And repeat the name again, because I like to do that for the indie authors.
It's Zachary Schatzer. I have.
There you go.
And
Okay,
finally, Richard, I have to say, I'm sorry that I stole PG Woodhouse from you.
No. I planned it. I said to myself, because I was going through my list, I said, oh no, Berthold's going to bring up PG Woodhouse, so I'll let him run with that, because we feel the same way, and I know we like the same things about that author. So yeah, no problem. Going back to Plimpton, I want you to know, because I did read I read some of his, I don't know if they were essays or what, it was a while back, but I read one of his books, and I think it was the one with the quarterback. But I got the feeling that somebody told him when he was younger, write what you know. And to himself, he made the joke, well, I don't know anything, so I'm going to go out.
Yes.
And then I'll write what I knew, you know?
Yes, exactly.
He really is. I admit with you. I know I have to go back and look at the way he ends chapters, but he really is incredibly creative in that sense. Right. He is definitely a literary writer in a non-literary genre. So
he wrote for Sports Illustrated for a while too, didn't he?
Yeah. I probably read a couple of articles there. So yeah. Okay. So I guess anything else for Berthold before we move to?
So what's the first Woodhouse book that I should read if I'm going to try one?
Mark, I'm going to caution you, because I know how you feel about humor books. Like, I know that there can be this disconnect. So it might be that it won't work for you, but I'm going to say Right Ho Jeeves. H-O Jeeves.
Right Ho Jeeves.
Yes, that's the first one I read. I have a lot of respect for another indie author, Noah Goetz, but he doesn't believe that's the best PG Woodhouse book, but he's just wrong on that. So there you go.
I think the first time it was Code of the Woosters. So
that's Noah's favorite.
Yeah, I really like that one too. So okay. All right, so when I looked at the list, I found this is my own thing I gave out to everybody. I found this to be the more difficult than I thought because I realized there are books that I love, as you were mentioning, specific books. And the writers may have written only one or two books, and that happens to be one of them. So I decided to look at writers who wrote, like I said, had a sizable portfolio. So I wasn't thinking so much as the book as to how they approach their writing and what they do. And so I came up with a huge list. I'm on my cell phone, but I'm definitely going to pare it down because I think I can. I'll be brief about it each. I'm going to combine the first two because it was just like you, Lucinda. When I was a child, I was reading some books and they made me think exactly. I said I could do this, and I would suggest these two writers for anyone who knows young people who are starting out may want to write because they are excellent at creating a plot and a twist. And again, back then. So they are Agatha Christie and Isaac Asimov. They're different genres you would think, but Isaac Asimov always writes like he's writing a mystery novel. Their writing skills, I would never say Isaac Asimov is a literary writer, but he is a genius when it comes to taking a common concept and moving it forward to what it could be like. What is the ultimate of that? And again, I've mentioned on other podcasts how much when I was a child, I loved reading Agatha Christie. It wasn't just that, the plot twist of who did it. It's that she did twists on the genre so that the author is the person who did it, so that the policeman who's investigating is the person who did it. And that's what made her at the time. So I think groundbreaking. So those two I lumped together. But stemming from that, I was going in progression of my time. Because I was reading a lot of science fiction, I stumbled across Ray Bradbury, who I loved his books. They were very much, beautiful escapist books. But as I got older, I started to realize there's a texture to them. And when I read a compendium of his short stories, I will also say this: he is someone to go to see how to craft a decent short story. They're all very different. They're not all science fiction. There's one, the ice cream suit or whatever, which is just so touching. It's always about people. And that's what I didn't realize when I first read him. He really is focused on human condition of individual people. Something Wicked This Way Comes. When I first read it, it was all about the October people and all that. But then I realized this is about one man coming to terms with his oncoming mortality. He's now at that age where he realizes and it's, does he get this will to live? What do you live for when you realize you're coming towards the end? Really, I love that. I love that about Bradbury. There's this whole surround of what's at the core, and that is the people. So following from that, a favorite author of mine, because I think this is pretty much comic genius because it's so difficult to do, is Richard Russo. I've read every one of his books. I think my favorite might have been the first one I read. It was called The Straight Man. It's just so funny because he manages to take everyday people, and yes, he does have quirky people mixed in, but even the everyday people are funny. And in not a side-splitting way, sometimes there is, he does throw in occasionally some slapstick, things. Like one scene I remember from The Straight Man about a car going down a hill and, because of ice, whatever, but really funny. But it's just their day-to-day attitudes and common people, usually small town. He always looks to focus on small town groups, Northeast especially. But it's just difficult to pull humor out of that, and he does it. So I always, revere him for that. Christopher Moore, I have to say, is the closest to what I love to write. He has written a huge number of books, and every single one of them, he takes mythology, even in Jesus, in his book Lamb, and he flips it around, and again focuses on the people. And two things I really like: there's always a love story at the center. And there's always a reasonably happy ending. He's not afraid to do that. I know we're in an age where nobody wants that anymore, but he consistently does it, but he does it well. And there's also, he does occasionally will dive into something historical. Sacre Bleu takes place in the age of the Impressionists. And if you read that book, you'll learn more about painting and the creation of paint colors, you know, and the what's the word I'm looking for, but pigments than you ever would have realized, and how important it was at that time, and the whole symbology. So really, really, to me, a genius writer for that reason. But again, it's in my field. It's comedy mixed with fantasy, you know, with mythology. And then let's see, I'm just going to hold to one. Well, I want to say Roger Zelazny, also in that same vein. But to one more, because I thought I should pick someone who I do love, and is from the classical area, and that is Charles Dickens. And again, I love Charles Dickens. If you could strip away all that Victorian bulk that had to go in stories, and I think we talked about that once, where that Industrial Revolution gave people to actually read. You know, the average person time to read, and parks were created because average people, you know, had free time. So reading books were the only form of real entertainment. So they had to be thick. They had to take up months of your time. But if you strip that away, you still come up with stories that are compelling, because behind his whatever his focus point is always these social issue stories. You know, they really bring them to life in a hard-hitting way, whether or not he's doing comedy, whether or not he's doing, you know, this sort of, you know, melodrama, etc. And that's another thing I love about him when I first read him, is he mixes that all in. It's not, the story isn't just sad. There's always bits of humor, or it isn't just funny. There's always a little bit of pathos. If you take all of that away, again, you're still left with what makes him a great writer, which is his indelible characters, which is why I also loved Woodhouse. He creates characters, you know, again, like Woodhouse, they're not realistic characters at the center in some ways. They're a little too perfect sometimes, but that's okay, because they're representations. And yet you can connect with them in some way. You could want them to win, you know, you could sympathize with them. So yeah. So Dickens would be the last one on my long list that I'm cutting others out. And yes, at the bottom is Woodhouse. Because I said I know he's going to be in it.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Am I the only one? Am I weird because I just don't get humor in stories?
Yes. No, it was part of the human condition. But no, I have close relatives that I'm very close, and they're the same way. And my mother, in fact, she never read a comedy, and I grew up with comedy around me. We used to watch the Marx Brothers, and she would just say, I don't see what you see in all this. But
I get it in film, in TV, in, you know, stand-up routines, whatever. But for some reason, when I'm reading, I just you would have to hit me over the head with a clown's red nose in
yeah,
order
no, that
for me
was
to
like, she loved poetry. She loved, you know, historical. She needed some realism, and comedy is not that, you know, except maybe like a Russo comes close.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I get it. I grew up with
There are two things about comedy which are really, really important. One is timing, you know, when you have interchange, and a lot of it is dialogue. And the second thing is the tone of voice and the emphasis that you put in certain places. And those two things together will make something either funny or horrendous.
Yeah.
And it's people, I can't think of any American things at the moment that a comedy duo. I mean, I'm obviously more familiar with British stuff or even South African stuff, but people like Saunders and French, I don't know whether you've ever seen them, but their timing is fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it funny. Oh gosh, you know, I've got such brain fog at the moment. It's I'm just blaming COVID all the time. Not my age or my dementia, I'm not sure which. But you know, the other comedy pairs, it's the timing, not necessarily even the words, it's the way it's said, the expressions on the faces, which you don't get on the page.
In a written page, right?
Yeah. So I read Lamb I think earlier
Oh,
this
you
year.
did write rewind. Okay.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned it, and also someone else I follow on Twitter who's become a very good social media friend of mine. She's a huge fan of his, and I read it, and it to me it's just okay. This is just kind of silly.
Well,
You know,
actually, that's a lot of people's favorite, but that isn't mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple others I like better. And again, I loved Sacre Blue. That was my first book I read of his was Coyote Blue, so blue in there. But I can see how he distanced himself out because it's kind of a little bit corny, but I love it. I really love it.
Yeah.
But there are others. Yeah, Lamb. Surprising. I know everyone loved Lamb. I liked it. It wasn't one of my, but a lot of people loved it. I
Yeah.
thought it's okay. So
You know what I'm going to suggest to you, Mark? There was a series done by Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie, an adaptation of the P.G. Wodehouse.
Yes, there
Yeah.
was.
You might almost look that up and see what you think of that.
But I want to read one just to
yeah,
see what it. I'm gonna read Right Ho Jeeves, right?
Yes.
I'm gonna read that.
And you're going to come
I'll
back and be
report
like,
back.
what are you talking about there?
Richard Russo's books have been made into films too. Paul Newman in Nobody's Fool, and I think they did Empire Falls as a series. But again, I watch them, I enjoy them, but sometimes there's something in the written sense that I think carries a little bit more, and that's and to Lucinda's point, in comedy you would not think that because you lose them, but sometimes for some authors it actually is in the written word. And by the way, Lucinda, the British comedy is my go-to. It is. I think you surpass at that, and especially sense of timing. You are correct about that.
I feel like I read a
unparalleled.
Richard Russo book, but I don't know.
I would say maybe Nobody's Fool. If I were going to suggest one, Straight Man is the other one, but no one ever. That's sort of like forgotten. I don't know why a lot of people don't point to that one, but
Okay.
that takes place in academia, so maybe that's why. I was in academia for quite a while, and it's definitely not an inside joke in terms of characterization. Like you'll recognize people, but I guess for just everyday people, Nobody's Fool might be a way to start. So again, not side-splitting humor. This is just everyday humor, kind of.
Yeah.
I think I prefer to just find humorous thing. Like it's one thing when there are humorous bits in a book that's otherwise not intended to be comic. I can't say I've ever read any books that were meant, that was the point of them, was to be funny. I rather have something where you're reading away and suddenly you read something and you realize you're laughing. I mean, that's fine with me. So maybe I should have a look at Wodehouse too, because that sounds like it's intended purely to be a comedy. So.
Oh yes.
Well, and again, I don't know if this is brain fog, but I'm blocking on the writer sense, one of my favorite writers too. Me Talk Pretty One Day. I have to look it up. It's a good book because it's I'm going to kill myself for not remembering the name, but he's talking about his own life experiences, and he does it hysterically, very hysterically funny.
David Sedaris.
David Sedaris. Thank you. Almost like blocking. But when you get to the pith of what he's talking about, they're really very horrible events in his life, mother with cancer, etc. And he throws those in little dribs and drabs. So it's kind of realism, but done in a funny style. And yeah, he's brilliant for that. I have to say, for being able to pull humor out of those serious events and not dwell on it in the story, but it's there. It keeps coming up, these little mentions of them. So, and they're all from his, autobiographical, generally, So. Okay, I thought this was a good episode.
I think it's awesome.
It was worth getting dressed up for.
If people
I thought you were about to go out. I just thought it was a little early.
I'm wearing sweatpants, if that makes it.
if people have a couple more minutes, I have a question I wanted to ask everybody.
Yeah.
Is everybody good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. The reason why I'm asking this is because, of course, Twitter. I saw someone, like right after our last talk, tweet something that basically criticized the lack of a trigger warning, something that she read, and the last line of her tweet was, "I didn't consent to reading that when I bought the book," or something like that. She didn't disclose what it was in the book that was she thought should be subject to a trigger warning. So here's my question. Trigger warnings, yay or nay? Do you
I'd
feel
say
like you
generally no, unless there's something, unless it isn't obvious that there might be something extreme in a book. Like I did read a book some time ago that the description of it made it sound like a sort of psychological thriller type of thing involving somebody who was inclined to be a murderer. But the point of the book was to describe in vivid detail horrible things being done to
yeah.
one person by another, like physical detail, grossness, just I mean, it was fairly well written and all that, but I didn't realize it was going to be like that. And if I had known, then I would not have picked up the book. So I think if your book doesn't indicate just by its description and title and cover and all that, that it's got some extreme stuff in it, then you probably do owe it somewhere to maybe not call it trigger warning, but to just indicate that this book contains some pretty harsh stuff, whether it's sex or violence or gore or grossness or whatever. So I think that's about as much as I would say on that. Otherwise, I don't think, I mean, if a book is written for adults, then you might find something in there that you personally will find tough to read. And then you just either skip over it or you just close the book and that's it. But I don't think you need to blame the author for not, engaging, getting your consent or whatever. That term to me seems to come from somewhere else and not really apply in this case.
I was going to say the same thing. It's the wording of that irked me more than the concept of, maybe making it clear what is, as you say, what is in the book. I started thinking, do we need, those mature audiences only kind of things on book? I personally wouldn't care if that had to be done, but I can't predict what a reader's going to be incensed by or not. I mean,
it could become this thing where it's kind of like a commercial for a prescription drug, where that last half of the commercial is all the things that might happen if you take it.
Right.
I mean, what's the laundry list of things that we might possibly have to warn a reader about if they read a story that we write? And I mean, one of the reasons why this comes up for me is, for the most part, well, I don't know. I mean, someone always dies in my stories. So if you have a problem with death, then maybe I need to trigger warn that. But the novella that I just published, there's gun violence, there's a threatened sexual assault, there's things, and I don't want to put those in a trigger warning because it basically tells a reader what's coming.
Yeah, that's the other thing. You giving away critical plot elements.
Go ahead, Lucinda.
You sure? I'm thinking that I've heard some vague rumors from the Amazon side, not directly from them, but from other authors, that we might have to put kind of descriptions of some sort on our books to say if there's going to be sex, violence, and all the rest of it. And to be quite honest, I mean, without being terribly rude, we're all of a certain mature age, people on the panel today. But it seems to be that the younger woke society can be upset by just about anything. And I mean, I'm struggling at the moment. I would never use the F word or the C word in a book. But I've got a character in prison at the moment, and he's not going to say bother when he somebody knifes him in the back with a shit, whatever they call them, because that sort of language is accepted. But everything that you can think of virtually, and I'm not saying I'm so famous or well known that I could be cancelled, you know, culture cancelled immediately. But I think
I
it's a
wouldn't know.
nightmare these days. You know, it's I don't know where somebody's being upset about something at every stage. Oh, I didn't realize there was going to be a murder. That's why I think so many people are writing these cozy mysteries where people die, but you're not near the blood. You just hear about it. Oh, the railway tracks yesterday. No description, no going into anything. And to my mind, they're soft, soppy, and boring because everybody's so lovely to each other, and it's just not life, and it's not real character. And then they're all squeaky clean and pleasant and polite. Life isn't like that, but they seem to want it to be like that, and it's just never going to happen.
Yeah,
People complain. I'm sorry, I just need to say real quick. People complain that I write depressing stories, and my response is, "Where's the drama and happy?" You know, I'm sorry, but in order to get to happy, you got to go through something, don't you?
I mean,
Exactly.
I wrote a thing that I've never published, and I don't know if I ever would publish it, but I mean, it was pretty dark. It was like a dark, weird Western, basically. And even before giving it to like friends to read, I wrote a note in the front that was like, this book is set in the 1800s in a very harsh and brutal time, and it doesn't shy away from describing that. If anything that you think would have gone on in that time would bother you, don't read this, basically. So without trying to spoil anything, I was just like, you know, if what you think is bad about that time doesn't sound like it's for you, it's not for you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind the generic stuff, like, you know, contains mature situations.
Yeah.
I don't know what those situations are, but, you know, then I don't have to give any elements away. Something like that contains violence, sex scenes, mature situations, whatever it is. And
Like
I'm not crazy about it, but that isn't, you know, isn't going to break my bank, as it were.
But
Yeah.
how many times do you get people who say, "Oh, this is a terrible series," say on TV? I watched all 16 episodes and I was disgusted by all of them. And you think there is an off switch. You know, you can put your thumb there and you can turn it off or even change channel. But no, you watch all 16 episodes and then you bitch about it.
I
always hear that. Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
I was watching Trevor Noah's final episode on The Daily Show, is a show we have here, and he said he thanked the people who just hate watch this show because they kept the ratings up. So yeah, you know, if they watch every episode and they hate it, I'm not going to complain. But
whenever I see that, I hear the voice of Graham Chapman from Monty Python whenever they would do one where he writes in objecting to whatever the latest skit was.
Yes, the letter would come up.
Yes.
I remember that.
It always comes back to Monty Python, doesn't it?
It always does.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, well. Okay. That's maybe something we could follow up with again in another episode.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Have great holidays.
Have
Yes.
a great holiday, everyone, and a good New
Yeah.
Year. Probably won't see you till next month at least. So.
Right. Happy
Yeah.
New
Okay.
Year.
Thank you.